Welcome to Taverns and Caverns. This is my very first video in my very first series. This is going to be a play-along campaign called Starting from Scratch. It is for brand new DMs and players of D&D 5e. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the very first installment of what will be a 21-part series. My intention in creating this campaign is twofold. To model the process of creating a D&D campaign from scratch for DMs/groups that have little to no experience in RPGs or D&D. And the second is to provide a playable campaign that enriches and challenges the game of more seasoned RPGers as well. The only materials you should need to have and be familiar with are the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook. Some of my content may reference books or other material that may not be readily available or accessible to every viewer, but I will do my best to make sure that this campaign setting is completely self-contained, especially from any existing IP aside from the core rules. If you're watching this as a means of enriching your own gaming experience and campaign design abilities, then sit back and watch it in any order. The content will be thematically organized so that you can pick and choose your path through the topics. If you are hoping to play along with this campaign directly, I advise that you watch the series in order, moving forward through the episodes as your group progresses through the campaign. Everything in this series is essentially a spoiler for the players in the group, so really only DMs should be watching. That said, I believe that all players should try their hand at DMing at some point. So don't feel discouraged from watching this if you are not the designated DM of your group. In the end, this content is here for you to use as you wish. For absolute beginners to the game, D&D can be a very difficult thing to jump into. For that reason, new groups, even amongst experienced gamers, will often start with a session 0, an intro session of sorts. This is a chance for players and DM to come to agreement on party dynamics, goals and expectations of gameplay, house rules, etc. Some players may need help finishing their character sheets or have questions about racial or class abilities or spells. Think about session 0 as a combination of reading the manual and playing that first training mission in a video game where you learn the controls and basic rules. This is also an opportunity to set the stage for what is to come in your campaign by providing some background about the world their characters live in and a general sense of the major features of this world. Your characters should be able to understand the world like a child might understand, enough to know how things generally work and at least some of the major social or political factions at play. The rest will be revealed through the encounters during sessions 1 and on. A framing device is good to use as an explanation of how your party of characters ended up together and as a way of focusing the conflict and motivations of PCs and NPCs. A common starting point is the old strangers in a tavern setup, where some event at a local tavern throws the players into a quest right away. I think I would get some shit in the comments if we went this route, and anyways, I prefer when every encounter, even in session 0, enriches the narrative of the campaign. So maybe we should wait until we know a little bit more about the world our characters live in before we start planning our first session. One of my favorite things about tabletop role-playing is that it exists primarily within the collective imaginations of your gaming group. There is no limit to the scope of the adventure, and I take every opportunity as a DM to infuse my own creativity and interest into the narrative. I typically only use the official canon of D&D as inspiration or guidance in creating my own fantasy realms, as most of the fun is coming up with the details that make the world real. Although this can be a daunting and very involved process, if you paint with broad strokes and let the player's choices dictate the course of your creativity, you can start small and build it up as you go. One mistake I made earlier in my Game Master career was in developing too much of the campaign in advance. Believe it or not, the more intricately crafted your story arcs and plot twists span into the future, the less engaging it will be for your players. You will end up either dictating the course of the events to the point that the players feel they have no real agency in the world, or you'll have to tell your players to choose a certain path in order for your adventure to work. Your campaign should be like a well-written serialized novel, one that slowly reveals the details of the objective world through the characters and events within, rather than explicit narrative and supplementary content like maps, history books, diagrams, etc. Your world building should be focused on what is relevant to the development of the story. This constraint will keep your imagination within the realm of your player character's desired game, and keep your narrative tight and your options wide open as the story arcs reveal themselves. When starting from scratch, your first priorities in world building are actually identifying the important themes and motifs you want to explore, and then developing some initial characters, factions, and only after that can we begin fleshing out the broad strokes of the world. After all, the setting is there to enhance the story. Don't worry about filling in all the details in one go, as the more passes you take at it, the more you will bridge the gaps between different characters and motivations and how they relate to the developing world. You only need to go as deep as necessary to run your next encounter, and doing too much more work than that could result in wasted energy or the inadvertent railing of your campaign. You'll start to get a good feel for this balance in planning and improvising the more sessions you run. In order to create a narrative that continues to captivate and engage your players through every session, you're going to want to stick to a theme that everyone in your group can get behind. This would be a great time to consider the shared interests and favorite works of fiction of the group. For this campaign, I am playing with a group of friends that I know through music, and considering the shared political and social beliefs within the group, I think going with an anti-establishment themed narrative that pits the party against a powerful economic cabal would be agreeable and suitably engaging angle. I don't want to force the players into any particular alignment or allegiances, so there should be at least 3 spheres of influence at play in this world, with no clear good or bad side. In general, I think that morality-centered conflicts can be a little predictable and detract from the feeling that anything can happen and that character choices really do affect the world they live in, with lasting and interconnected consequences. To that end, I like sticking to ethical conflict, where there is less of a line between good and evil and more about competing interests vying for dominance in the world. With that in mind, I think the initial conflict driving the story will revolve around a seafaring merchant guild representing many industrial interests and driving the economic development of many regions. This merchant guild is closely aligned with a religious empire that is slowly but steadily colonizing the world through their political and economic influence. And although the two entities are connected, they are distinct and not opposed to pursuing their own interests over the other, similar to how member states within NATO might operate. The third faction is a militaristic network of local cultures that is violently opposed to the expansion of the religious empire across many continents and conducts guerrilla warfare tactics of questionable ethics. Before you even start session 0, you should probably get with your group of player characters and at least identify what genre you're going to want your setting to take place in. I know my group is going to want to play the traditional medieval fantasy type setting that is classic to the D&D rule set. So we're going to start there and expand as necessary. Magical creatures, spirits, and gods are all real. The world is high magic, low technology, and is in a period of its social and cultural development akin to late medieval Europe, with the exception of naval and commercial technology in our world, which will be more in line with the period of Western colonial expansion. Buildings are stone, wood, or brick, and metallurgy includes crude steel, but iron is still more common. Of course, you can use the D&D system for any genre of campaign, although you may need to reskin various aspects of the game with respect to technological level or any other factors that may determine the fantastical elements of your imaginary world. That said, I recommend starting in the same classic fantasy setting that D&D was written for until you get a feel for the mechanics and how to run a session. Our world will be populated by all the same races represented in D&D and most of the same monsters, although we will be creating some of our own custom humanoid and monster types. Geographic and ecological conditions in our world are similar to Earth, except that the continental land masses are smaller, further apart, and more numerous. This is an important part of my strategy to constrain player choice throughout the storyline. The vast distances and expensive travel will force players to at least have to confront the conflicts presented as we establish the beginning of our narrative. You should always make sure to include natural and contextually relevant constraints to player agency in an effort to keep all players engaged and reacting to what's happening in front of them. Flora and fauna in our world are also very similar to Earth, but with some custom creatures inspired by prehistoric animals sprinkled in for fun. I was very much into fossils and dinosaurs as a child, so I can draw on that knowledge to make the world feel simultaneously more fantastical and more real. Now that the very basic elements of our theme and setting have been established, let's start defining the factions influencing the mechanisms of history in our world. Knowing how the bigger gears turn and interact behind the scenes will allow you to respond more fluidly and realistically to your players' interaction with NPCs, and will allow for the whole world to reflect the choices they make. I think I'll start with the Merchant Guild. I've always been fascinated with the story of the Rothschilds and their rise to economic power and political influence. So I've decided that this guild was founded by a family of financiers and money brokers called the Gelttasch dynasty. Over 5 centuries old at this point, the current era of economic and political expansion was marked by the independent city-state that they founded about 200 years ago in order to escape the taxation of their economic ventures by local political powers. They took their whole commercial operations to an unclaimed island and just built their own nation from scratch, totally disrupting the local balance of power and resulting in the fragmentation of many emerging empires. They soon attracted other merchant organizations and commercial interests and eventually united in their pursuit of profits through the formation of the Transoceanic Cooperation League. Although many of the other political powers in the world are skeptical of their long-term motives, they are apt to engage economically where mutually beneficial. The TOCL goes to great lengths to integrate themselves with the local elites through their patronage of the arts and charitable contributions to religious orders. To the common people of the world, the Guild represents opportunity for growth and advancement, although with that growth always comes change. One of the various religious states in this world has benefited more than others from the past 2 centuries of global economic expansion and through an aggressive military campaign backed by its ever-increasing military and political power. This religion worships the goddess of fertility and motherhood, Freja, the primary deity in a pantheon of gods traditionally associated with the human cultures from the northern region of this world. The imperial house of Eja had humble roots 3 centuries ago as a remote agrarian kingdom of farming clans in a lush but isolated mountain valley on one of the world's numerous small island continents, this one called Ingbus. Through the benevolence of their matron goddess Freja, they developed a prosperous culture centered around the production of grain and other agrarian produce, and soon rose to be the dominant culture on the island, far away from the majority of other civilized kingdoms and states of the world. This changed shortly after the Gelttasch dynasty annexed an uninhabited rocky island near the southern coast of Ingbus. The House of Eja and the TOCL soon struck a prosperous business relationship in which the Merchant Guild trades the valuable and ample agricultural surplus of Ingbus to the rest of the world, and the House of Eja uses their profits to fund and legitimize their ambitions to bring the prosperity of Freja and their culture to every continent of the world. Finally, there is a growing faction of resistance in the religious and economic order that is reshaping the myriad island continents and their respective peoples. Using highly controversial tactics, this loose network of guerrilla militias, comprised of humanoid races and cultures in various locales, is making itself an obstacle to the growth of both the TOCL and the House of Eja. Little is known about the organization itself, nor its origins, but public opinion towards them range from supportive or sympathetic to fearful or antithetic, largely based on the level of prosperity gained through the burgeoning world order. One thing is sure, the escalation of conflict between these 3 groups is rapidly causing great upheaval and change to a long static social and political landscape. So, to paraphrase our global political scenario, imagine the merchant families of the Renaissance Italian city-states were headed by a family like the Rothschilds during the Napoleonic Wars, and they had allied themselves with a monarchy similar to the Holy Roman Empire, only they're Vikings, and instead of crusading in the Holy Land, they focused on finding the New World and growing their economic influence. Our resistance fighters are kind of like the Native Americans, the Asians, and the Africans forming a global revolutionary movement somewhere akin to the Zapatistas mixed with a little Al-Qaeda. Already sounding dramatic. I think that's plenty of development on the world at large to carry us most of the way through this 4-level campaign. Remember that this tier of the game is all about our player characters becoming figures of influence and renown in their local region. We don't have to worry about what's happening on a global level in any specific detail, except as it directly relates to the narrative. But having a general sense of the forces at work will provide a consistency to your NPC motivations and actions, as well as the repercussions of the player's choices throughout the campaign. Okay, now all we have to do is figure out that framing device for bringing the player characters into the world. Given that a majority of the population of our world only travels substantial distances from home due to political, military, or economic ventures, I think the best way to bring the various party characters together is by having them be new hires into a private mercenary company that promises adventure and treasure in exchange for 1 short year of service. Having just signed their contracts, our party begins in training camp and as newly sworn-in members of the Crimson Cloaks. This organization has a short but eventful history as they follow the wake of economic expansion through the globe, attacking or defending for anyone that can afford the loyalty of their commanders and investors. Since we are preparing for Session 0, a military base on an island will serve for a very limited environment as far as player agency is concerned, but still provides ample rooms for characters and narrative development. The main focus of this session is to introduce the players to the world and their characters, while also introducing them to the core game mechanics of social interaction and combat. The session will be loosely inspired by Full Metal Jacket as the party prepares for deployment. There should only be a few NPCs on this base, but there should be enough red shirts on hand to challenge your players should they decide to make a decision above their rank or pay grade, like trying to leave the island. I think the commanding officer, his assistant, and the quartermaster should all provide ample room for social interaction and narrative exposition. Beyond that, some training exercises like sparring with wooden weapons, target practice with ranged weapons and spells, and maybe an obstacle course to introduce skill or ability checks should be a perfect frame for the demonstration of game mechanics. Again, think of this like a training mission in a first-person shooter or an RPG like Portal or later Fallout titles. It should be fun, educational, and relevant to the story at large. So that was a lot to go through for a first exercise in world building, but don't fret. The next step is a lot of fun as we get to design our first encounters in this campaign. We will get our hands dirty as we develop the first 3 NPCs, drops, and maps, and plan out our training sessions. I hope you enjoyed this exercise in world building. Please join us in part 2 of Session 0 in the Play Along campaign, where we will be designing our first encounters. Thanks again for watching Taverns and Caverns premiere episode. Hope you enjoyed it.